Chapter 16. Through the rooms and halls of a mansion, Claire had run, afraid to hear him scream again, afraid not to because she didn't know where to look. Past a plushy, decorated hall, she found herself in a prison area, cells on either wall, the environment cold and dark once more. A lone virus carrier reached for her from behind bars, wailing, "Steve!" Her voice echoed back at her, full of tension and fear, but Steve didn't answer. There was a thick metal door to her right, different than the others, reinforced by bands of steel. She opened it, stepping into a small, bare room that opened into a much larger one. "Steve!" No answer, but the bigger room was long and dimly lit, a kind of huge hall, and she couldn't see what was at the other end. She saw that there was a suspended gate between the small room and hall, which definitely gave her pause. She looked around and found a piece of broken wood on the floor, then wedged it between the outer door and its frame, not wanting to end up locked inside. She hurried into the giant hall, intimidating, oversized statues of knights lining the heavily shadowed walls, her anxiety growing with every passing second. Where was he? Why had he screamed? She was halfway down the hall when she saw him, slumped in a chair at the far end, some kind of restraining bar across his chest. Oh God. Claire ran, and as she got closer, she could see that the bar was a huge axe, a halberd, the blade firmly entrenched in the wall next to him. He seemed very small and very young, his eyes closed and head down, but she could see that he was breathing and felt less anxious. She reached aside and pulled at the giant axe, but it wouldn't budge. She crouched next to him, touching his arm, and he stirred, opened his eyes. "Claire!" "Steve, thank God you're all right. What happened? How did you get here?" Steve pushed at the long axe handle but couldn't move it either. "Alexia. It had to be Alexia. She looked just like Alfred. She injected me with something. She said she was going to do what she'd done to her father, but she was going to get it right this time." He shoved at the axe again, straining, but it wasn't moving. "In other words, she was whacked. I guess she and Alfred were pretty close after all." Steve trailed off, his cheeks suddenly flushing with color. His hands started to twitch, his body trembling. "What is it?" Claire asked, afraid. So afraid because his body was hunching over, his fingers clenching to fists, his eyes wild and terrified. "Claire." His voice dropped an octave, her name becoming a growl. And then he was writhing in the chair, his clothes ripping. He opened his mouth and a liquid moan came out. Frightened at first, but then angry. Furious. "No," Claire whispered, started to back away, and Steve grabbed a halberd, wrenching it out of the wall, standing up. His body continued to hunch over, his head dropping down, muscles rippling beneath skin that was turning a gray green. Spikes rose up from his left shoulder, 2, 3 of them, as his hands elongated, as a giant, bloodless wound grew across his back, as his eyes turned red and animal. The thing that had been Steve Burnside opened its mouth and screamed, enraged, and Claire turned and sprinted away, sick with loss and fright, running for all she was worth. The monster came after her, swinging the massive axe, the sharp edge whistling through the air. She could feel the wind from the swinging blade and somehow found more speed, her legs pumping, pushing her faster. The monster swung again, hit something, the sound vast and deafening. Faster, faster, the small room just ahead. And the gate was coming down, was about to lock her into the hall with the monster. How? Didn't matter. She had to go faster still, or she was dead. And with one final, brutal push, Claire dove for the shrinking space between the bottom of the gate and the floor, sliding in on her stomach, the gate crashing closed behind her. The monster roared, began swinging the axe with abandon, sparks flying as it attacked the metal bars. In shock, Claire watched it break through 3 of them, bending the steel by the very ferocity of its blows, before she realized she could get out. I propped the door open, she thought dazedly, and stood up, took a single step toward her escape. And then something broke through the wall with a crash. Not the monster, a thing that wrapped around her like a constrictor, lifting her, another of the tentacles. The monster continued to hack at the metal. It would break through in seconds, and the tentacle had her tightly in its rubbery grasp. Awakened from her daze, Claire beat at her captor, pried at it, but the matter was impervious. It simply held her, waiting for the monster to breach the gate. It wanted to beat her and cut her. It wanted to rip her apart. So it slammed the weapon into the bars over and over, and finally, there was a hole it could pass through. She was making noises in the grip of the thing that held her, gasping noises that made its blood hot and excited, that made it raise the axe, lusting for the end of her. It brought the axe down hard, remembered what he told her, promised her. You can get the next one. I will. And he, stopped, the blade almost touching her skull. The tentacle waited, gripped her tighter, and he remembered. Claire. Steve lifted the axe again, strong. He was so strong, and slammed it down into the tentacle, slicing through. In a spray of green fluid, the thick coil snapped and hit him in the chest, throwing him into the wall before retreating. He felt and heard ribs break, felt the boil of his blood cooling, felt his strength going away. The pain came, sharp and dull and everywhere. But he opened his eyes, and she was there. She was safe. She was reaching for his hand. Claire Redfield, reaching for his hand with tears in her eyes. The monster was gone. She reached out to hold his hand, and he lifted it to his face, to his beautiful, dying face, laying it across his cheek. You're warm, he whispered. Hang on, she said, pleading, the knot in her throat choking her. Please, my brother came and he'll take us with him. Please don't die. Steve's eyes were fluttering as though he were trying very hard to stay awake. I'm glad your brother came, he whispered, his voice fading. And I'm glad I met you. I love you. On the last word, his head fell forward, his chest falling and not rising again. And then Claire was alone. Steve was gone. Chapter 17. Chris ran, knowing that their time was short as long as Alexia Ashford was alive, afraid that she might already have gotten to Claire. Claire! He shouted, banging his fist on every door he passed. It didn't matter, his shouting. If Alexia was even half as powerful as he suspected, she already knew where he was, and where Claire was. Please, please don't hurt her, he thought, the thought repeating itself as he ran down another hall, through a door, another hall, and another. He didn't know if anything could stop Alexia, but if he could find Claire and get them to the evac elevator, he meant to try and trigger the self-destruct system before leaving. Alexia was halfway to omnipotence and purely evil. She was an apocalypse waiting to happen, and she had to be stopped. Claire! Through a familiar hallway, another Spencer estate copy, through a door that opened into some kind of shadowy prison, holding cells lining the walls. He had to find her. If he couldn't leave. He wanted Alexia dead, but he wouldn't endanger Claire's life, not for anything. And getting her out took absolute priority. And somebody was crying behind one of the closed doors. Chris stopped running and listened, trying not to breathe, tuning out the relentless banging of a virus carrier locked in another cell. Another gasping wail. "Claire, oh, thank God you're alive." He ripped the door open, ready to hurt anything even close to her, and saw her sitting on the floor, sobbing, her arms wrapped around a young man, his naked body bruised and pitiful. He was dead. Oh, shit. It could only be Steve, Claire's friend, and though he was sorry for the boy he'd never met, Chris's heart was breaking for her. She looked so fragile, so alone. Something else lay at Alexia's doorstep. Chris had no doubt that Steve had died because of that crazy bitch, but as much as he wanted to sit down and comfort Claire, to hold her hand and let her grieve, he knew they had to get out. "We have to go now, Claire," he said as gently as possible, and was relieved when she nodded, carefully laying her friend down, closing his eyes with one trembling hand. She kissed him on the forehead and then stood up. "Okay," she said, nodding again. "I'm ready." She didn't look back, and in spite of everything, he was proud of her. She was strong, stronger than he would have been if he'd been asked to leave someone he'd cared about. Together, they ran back into the hall, Chris figuring that they had to be close to the southwest corner of the building, where he'd landed the jet and seen the emergency evacuation elevator. The self-destruct system was presumably close enough to the elevator to make a fast escape possible. If they could just get to that elevator, he'd check every floor on the way up. There were stairs at the south end of the hall, and Chris ran for them, Claire at his side. He could feel the seconds ticking past as they hurried up the steps, felt like time was closing in on them, that Alexia was finished playing. Through the door at the top of the stairs, running out onto a giant metal grind platform, and Chris laughed out loud when he looked behind them, saw the nondescript doors of the emergency elevator. "What?" Claire asked. He motioned at the doors, grinning. "That'll take us straight to the jet." Claire nodded, not smiling, but she looked relieved. "Good, let's go." Chris had turned back to look at the wall across from the lift. "I've got to check something first," he said, wanting to take a closer look at the corner door. It looked like a security door. "You go, I'll be right there." "Forget it," Claire said firmly. She walked after him, her eyes red from crying, but her chin set and determined. "No way we're splitting up again." Chris leaned down to look at the door's locking mechanism and sighed, standing back up. They were probably at the self-destruct system already. The lock was complicated and unique, requiring a key he didn't have. Besides which, to the right of the door was a locked-down grenade launcher of some kind, one he didn't recognize. The bar holding it down labeled, "Emergency release only." Just as well. We should get out while we still can, he thought, but wasn't happy about it. How much more powerful would Alexia become before another chance like this one? Hey, wait a sec, Claire said, and began rummaging through the small backpack around her waist. Before he could ask, she was holding up a slender metal key shaped like a dragonfly. There was no question it would fit the lock. "I found it back at Rockford," she said, bending over and pressing it into the indentation. It fit perfectly, the lock releasing with a solid metallic clink. "You're going to set off to self-destruct, aren't you?" Claire said, not really a question. "Do you have the code?" Chris didn't really answer, thinking that there were an amazing number of coincidences in life, and sometimes they work to one's advantage. "Code Veronica," he said softly, and pulled the door open, ready to take it all down, understanding that it was meant to be.